Hello and welcome back to Diplomacy and Discourse. I'm your host AR and I'm thrilled you've joined me today. Whether you're a regular here or you've just hit play for the very first time, settle in, get comfortable, and let's dig into a topic that sits right at the beating heart of American democracy. Now, if you caught our last episode, you'll remember the Great American Reshuffle, the way millions of people have been packing up and moving from places like California and New York to the Sunbelt states of Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas. We talked about why they move and what it does to the states they leave behind and the states they pour into. But here's the thing I left dangling at the end of that conversation, and it's the thread we are picking up today. When people move, they don't just take their furniture and their tax dollars with them. They take their political weight. Because in the United States, representation follows people. And when the map of where Americans live gets redrawn by migration, sooner or later the map of who represents them has to get redrawn too. That process has a name. It's called redistricting, and its darker, more controversial cousin is called gerrymandering. Today we're going to unpack both: what redistricting is and why it's supposed to happen, how gerrymandering works, and the two sneaky tactics at its center, why politicians of both parties can't resist it, and the genuinely wild stuff that's happened in 2025 and 2026. Then we'll look ahead to what it all means for our democracy. So grab your coffee, let's draw some lines. Let's start with the basics, because this is one of those civic topics that sound dry until you realize it quietly decides who holds power in this country. Here's the simplest way I can put it. The U.S. House of Representatives has 435 seats. Each seat represents a chunk of the country called a congressional district. And every district is supposed to contain roughly the same number of people. Redistricting is just the process of drawing the boundaries of those chunks, deciding which neighborhoods, which towns, which counties go into which district. Think of it like slicing a pizza for a big group. The fair way is to make sure everyone gets roughly the same amount. Redistricting is the act of deciding where the knife comes down. And just like at the dinner table, where the knife falls can spark an argument, because some slices are a lot more appetizing than others. So why do we redraw these lines at all? Why not just set them once and leave them alone? The answer is that people are constantly moving and the population is constantly changing. Our Constitution requires a national headcount, the census, every 10 years. Once we know the new numbers, the lines have to shift so that each district still holds about the same number of people. If one district has ballooned to 1 million residents, while another has shrunk to half that, the people in the crowded district effectively have their voices watered down. One person, one vote only works if the districts are balanced. There are a few ground rules that the Constitution, federal law, and decades of court rulings layer on top of this. First, districts have to be close to equal in population. That's a big one. Second, they can't discriminate against racial or language minorities. That protection comes largely from the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A landmark civil rights law we'll return to today. And third, in most states, districts must be geographically contiguous. You can't have a district that's two separate islands with no connection between them. For most of American history, this followed a pretty predictable rhythm. Census, then redistricting every 10 years, like clockwork. Tick, tock, redraw. Hold on to that idea of the steady 10-year cycle, because one of the biggest stories of the last 2 years is exactly how that rhythm got blown apart. Okay, so that's redistricting in its honest, well-behaved form. A necessary housekeeping chore for a democracy. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because the moment you give human beings the power to draw the lines, some of them are going to be tempted to draw those lines not for fairness, but for advantage. And that brings us to our second big word of the day. Gerrymandering is what you get when redistricting goes to the dark side. It's the deliberate manipulation of district boundaries to give one political party an edge over the other. The word itself has a fun origin story. Back in 1812, the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, signed off on a district so twisted that a newspaper cartoonist decided it looked like a salamander. They mashed up the governor's name with salamander and called it gerrymander. 2 centuries later, we're still using the term. Now, how do you actually rig a map? It comes down to 2 core tactics, and once you learn them, you'll never look at an electoral map the same way again. The 2 tactics are called cracking and packing. Let me explain cracking first. Imagine your opponent's voters are like a strong cup of coffee. If you want to weaken that coffee, you don't drink it straight. You pour it into a bunch of different glasses and top each one off with water until it's barely got any flavor left. Cracking does the same thing to voters. You take a community that leans heavily toward the other party and you slice it up, scattering those voters across many different districts. In each one, they end up as a minority, outnumbered and outvoted. Their collective strength gets diluted into nothing. Packing is the opposite move, and it's just as cynical. Instead of spreading the opposition out, you cram as many of them as possible into 1 or 2 districts and let them win those by gigantic, lopsided margins, 80-90%. Why hand your opponents a guaranteed win? Because every voter you stuff into that one district is a voter who isn't competing anywhere else. You concede 1 seat in a landslide, so you can comfortably win all the surrounding ones. It's like telling the other team, sure, you can have this one game by 50 points as long as you let me win the other 9. Crack to dilute, pack to contain. Those 2 tactics, used together, let a clever map drawer manufacture a result before a single real vote is cast. A party that wins, stay. Half the votes statewide can end up with 2/3 of the seat, just because of how the lines were drawn. And here's what makes the modern version so much more potent than Elbridge Gerry's salamander. Back in 1812, you were working with paper maps and rough guesses. Today, map drawers have detailed voter data and powerful computer software that lets them slice boundaries down to the level of an individual street or even a single city block. They know how your neighborhood voted in the last 6 elections. They can predict, with eerie accuracy, how a few hundred households will lean. The precision has gone from a butter knife to a laser scalpel. So why does this keep happening? Why don't politicians just behave themselves and draw fair maps? The honest answer is that the incentives push hard in the other direction, and the temptation is bipartisan. The first and most obvious motivation is partisan advantage. In most states, the legislator draws the congressional maps, and whichever party controls that legislator gets to hold the pen. If you're in charge and you can draw lines that lock in extra seats for your side for the next 10 years, that's an enormous prize. It's the rare opportunity to shape election outcomes before the campaign even begins. The second motivation is something called incumbent protection, and this one is sneakier because it's bipartisan in the worst way. Sometimes, the people drawing the maps aren't just trying to beat the other party. They're trying to protect everyone who already holds a seat on both sides. They carve out safe, comfortable districts so that the sitting member of Congress almost never have to face a real challenge. It's a cozy arrangement. Incumbents from both parties get job security, and the only people who lose are the voters, who no longer get a meaningful choice. And I really want to understand this because it's easy to think gerrymandering is a one-party sin. It absolutely is not. Both major parties do it, enthusiastically, wherever they have the power to. When Republicans control a legislature, they draw maps favoring Republicans. When Democrats control one, they favor Democrats. The tactics are identical. Only the beneficiary changes. As we get into the recent news, you'll see both parties throwing elbows. So judge the practice itself, not just the team you root for. Now, all of this would be interesting enough as a history lesson. But the reason we're doing this episode right now in 2026 is that redistricting has exploded into one of the biggest political stories of the moment. The quiet 10-year rhythm I told you to remember? It just got shattered. Let me walk you through what's been happening. Here's a statistic that genuinely stopped me in my tracks when I read it. Redrawing maps in the middle of a decade outside the normal post-census cycle used to be almost unheard of. Between 1970 and 2025, that's 55 years, only 2 states had voluntarily redrawn their maps mid-decade purely for bipartisan gain. 2 in over half a century. Then, 2025 happened, and that norm didn't just bend, it shattered. It started in Texas in the middle of 2025. With encouragement from the Trump administration, the Republican-controlled Texas legislature decided not to wait for the next census. They redrew their congressional map mid-decade with the goal of squeezing out roughly 5 additional Republican seats in the U.S. House. And that single move set off what observers have described as a political arms race. Because here's how these things go. The moment Texas did it, the other side felt it couldn't just sit there. In California, Democrats responded in kind. They put a measure on the ballot, Proposition 50, in November of 2025, designed to redraw California's map to net about 5 additional Democratic seats, deliberately canceling out the Texas gains, tit for tat. One side throws a punch, the other counterpunches. And then it spread. North Carolina's Republican legislature redrew its maps in October 2025, aiming for an 11-3 Republican majority. Missouri Republicans carved up the Kansas City area in September to grab seats. Florida, under Governor Ron DeSantis, enacted a new map in May 2026, aiming for up to 4 more Republican seats. Meanwhile, court orders forced redraws elsewhere. Ohio's bipartisan commission produced a new map, and Utah's Supreme Court threw out a map it found to be an illegal partisan gerrymander, shifting a seat toward Democrats. By the time the dust settled, more than half a dozen states had redrawn their lines mid-decade, something that simply did not happen in modern American history. Analysts who tallied it up suggested the partisan gains roughly canceled out close to a wash in net seats. But the precedent is the scary part. The unwritten rule that you wait for a census and leave the lines alone is now broken. And broken rules are very hard to unbreak. Let me zoom in on 2 states now, because they show you how this fight plays out on the ground and how the courts have responded. The first, North Carolina. When Republicans there passed their new 11-3 map in late 2025, civil rights groups sued, arguing it was a racial gerrymander that deliberately dismantled a historically significant region with a large black population. A panel of 3 federal judges looked at it and acknowledged something striking. They agreed The map had what they called a disparate impact on black voters. In plain terms, it hurt black voters' influence. But, and this is the crucial but, the court said the plaintiffs hadn't proven the mapmakers acted out of racial intent rather than partisan intent. And here's the legal trapdoor. A 2019 Supreme Court decision called Rucho v. Common Cause established that partisan gerrymandering is something federal courts will not police. They consider it a political question, not a legal one. So if a state can say, with a straight face, we didn't do this because of race, we did it purely to help our party win, the federal courthouse door largely slams shut. The map was allowed to proceed. Now, Virginia is where the Democrats played offense. Watching the national Republican push, Virginia Democrats tried a clever countermove, a special referendum asking voters to approve a constitutional amendment that would temporarily let the legislature redraw maps in response to gerrymandering elsewhere. In April 2026, voters approved it. Democracy in action, you might think. But then the Supreme Court of Virginia stepped in. In a narrow 4-3 decision in May 2026, the court nullified the amendment, not because of what it did, but how it was passed. The state constitution requires a full general election to fall between the two legislative votes needed to approve an amendment, and the court found early voting had already started before the second vote, violating the procedure. So the amendment was tossed on a technicality. The new maps were blocked, and Virginia's older court-drawn maps stayed in place. An emergency appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was turned away. It's a vivid reminder that in redistricting fights, process can matter as much as the maps. Now, I've mentioned the Supreme Court a few times, and I can't tell the story honestly without pausing on one decision that towers over everything else that happened this cycle. Because in the spring of 2026, the court fundamentally changed the rules of the game. The case is called Louisiana v. Calais, decided on April 29, 2026, in a 3-6 ruling. And to understand why it's such a big deal, you need to know about the Voting Rights Act, that 1965 civil rights law that I keep mentioning. For decades, Section 2 of that law was the single most powerful tool that minority communities had to challenge maps that diluted their voting power. If you could show a map unfairly weakened minority voters, you could get it struck down. Calais raised the bar dramatically. The case involved a Louisiana map that had actually been drawn to add a second majority black district, specifically to comply with a lower court's reading of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court said, in effect, that complying with the act is not by itself a good enough reason to use race as the main factor in drawing district lines, and it layered on tough new requirements for future vote dilution claims. Plaintiffs now have to provide an alternative map that satisfies all the state's political goals, including protecting incumbents, statistically untangible whether voting patterns are driven by race or just party, and prove present-day intentional discrimination, a much higher hurdle than the standard in place since 1982. Justice Elena Kagan, in a sharp dissent, warned that these new requirements would make these cases nearly impossible to win, that they'd render Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, in her words, quote, all but a dead letter, end quotes. And the real-world consequences came fast. Within hours of the Calais decision, Florida's legislature moved forward on a map that dismantled minority districts, citing the new ruling as their legal cover. The decision didn't just decide one case in Louisiana. It handed every state legislator in the country a powerful new argument. Combine Calais with that earlier Rucho decision, partisan gerrymandering is off limits to federal courts, and you arrive at a striking place. If a state draws a map that hurts minority voters, it can often defend itself by saying, that wasn't about race, it was about politics. And politics, the courts have said, is not their department. It's a 1-2 punch that leaves state legislators with more freedom to draw aggressive maps than they have had in generations. I want to step back and connect two threads, because they explain why this is all happening now and not, say, 30 years ago. The first thread is technology. Mapmakers today use Geographic Information Systems, or GIS software that lets them build districts with surgical precision. They layer in enormous datasets, how every precinct has voted going back years, party registration, even consumer behavior data. And they use mathematical measures like the efficiency gap to score how much partisan advantage a map squeezes out. They can run thousands of versions and pick the one that performs best for their side. This isn't a smoky backroom with colored pencils anymore. It's data science aimed at winning elections before they happen. The second thread ties us right back to the last episode, migration. Remember how people flooded out of California and New York into Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas? When people move like that, districts fall out of balance. The places they leave end up with too few residents per district. The places they flood into with too many. The technical word for that imbalance is malapportionment, and it gives politicians a ready-made justification to redraw the lines. In fact, Florida's Governor DeSantis argued in 2026 that the state was forced to redistrict precisely because growth since 2020 had left it malapportioned. So migration isn't just an economic story or housing story. It's the spark that lights the redistricting fuse. Alright, let's pull back and ask the question that really matters. Beyond the political horse race, what does all this map manipulation actually do to us as a country? The biggest causality is competition. When maps are drawn to be safe for one party or for incumbents on both sides, the number of genuinely competitive districts shrink. Researchers who studied the redistricting after the 2020 census found exactly this. The new maps created safer districts and reduced competition. And a house full of safe seats changes the character of our politics. If a district is guaranteed to go to one party, the November election becomes a formality, and the real contest moves to that party's primary, where only the most committed, ideological voters show up. That rewards candidates who play to the extremes, which is a big part of why our politics feels so polarized and gridlocked. The second causality is accountability. The whole idea of representative democracy is that voters choose their representatives. Gerrymandering quietly flips that around. When lines are drawn this precisely, it starts to feel like the representatives are choosing their voters, handpicking who gets to be in their district to guarantee re-election. And when a politician knows they basically can't lose, the pressure to listen, to compromise, to actually represent people gets a lot weaker. And the third causality, especially in light of Calais, is the voice of minority communities. The Voting Rights Act was built specifically to make sure that racial and language minorities couldn't be drawn out of meaningful representation. As that protection weakens, the risk grows that these communities get cracked and packed right out of the political influence they fought hard to win. So is there any good news here? Are there any ways to fix this? Yes. Though this cycle showed us that even the fixes are fragile. The most popular reform idea is the Independent Redistricting Commission. The concept is simple and appealing. Instead of letting the politicians who benefit from the maps draw them, you hand the job to an independent, nonpartisan, or bipartisan body. Several states have adopted these commissions, and they have had real success in producing fairer maps. But here's the sobering lesson from 2025 and 2026. Reforms are only as strong as the political will to represent them. In California, Democrats used a ballot initiative to go around the map their own independent commission had drawn because they felt they had to answer Texas. In Virginia, Democrats tried to use a constitutional amendment to bypass the process entirely. When the stakes get high enough, even well-designed guardrails can get knocked down. The other big avenue is the courts. But as we've seen, Rucho took federal courts out of the partisan gerrymandering business, and Calais narrowed what's left of the Voting Rights Act. So increasingly, the action has shifted to state courts and state constitutions, where some of the most important recent rulings, like Utah's, have happened. The battleground is moving, but the fight is far from over. So where does this leave us heading into the future? The honest answer is that 2025 and 2026 set a more aggressive tone that's likely to stick. The mid-decade redistricting wave may become a recurring feature of our politics, especially whenever control of Congress hangs by a thread. The old taboo against redrawing lines between censuses is gone. And the next big milestone is already on the horizon, the 2030 census, which will trigger the next official nationwide round. That round is shaping up to be the most contentious in the living memory, fought with all the new tools and precedents forged in this turbulent period. The weakened Voting Rights Act, the off-limits status of partisan gerrymandering in federal court, and ever more powerful mapping technology. Migration will keep driving the pressure too. As long as Americans keep flowing toward the Sun Belt, states like Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas will keep gaining congressional seats, while California, New York, and Illinois keep losing them. The map of where we live will keep redrawing the map of who governs us. The only real question is whether that redrawing happens fairly, or whether it keeps getting captured by whichever party holds the pen. Let's bring this all together. We started with a simple, almost boring idea that district lines have to be redrawn ever so often to keep representation fair as people move around. That's redistricting, and in its honest form, it's a healthy and necessary part of democracy. But we saw how that same power, in the wrong hands, becomes gerrymandering, the art of cracking your opponents into irrelevance and packing them into harmless corners, now executed with the precision of modern data science. We saw that both parties do it, that it's driven by the hunger for partisan advantage and the comfort of incumbent protection, and that 2025 and 2026 unleashed an unprecedented, norm-shattering wave of mid-decade map drawing, backed by Supreme Court decisions that have dramatically loosened the old legal restraints. Here's the takeaway I most want you to carry out the door. Redistricting might be the most important political process that most Americans never think about. It happens quietly, far from the noise of campaign rallies, but it shapes everything downstream. Who runs, who wins, whose voice counts, and whether your vote is a real choice or a foregone conclusion. The lines on the map are the scaffolding of our democracy. And as we've seen this year, when nobody's watching, that scaffolding can be quietly rebuilt to favor the people already in power. So pay attention to your state's maps. Ask who drew them and why. Because in a very real sense, the people who draw the lines are drawing the boundaries of your political power. That's our episode for today. If drawing the lines helped you finally understand a topic that touches every election you'll ever vote in, do me a favor and share it with a friend who cares about where our democracy is headed. It genuinely helps the show grow. And if you have a minute, leave us a rating or review wherever you're listening. I would love to hear your take on this one. Has your own district ever looked strange on a map? Do you think independent commissions are the answer? Send your thoughts, questions, and respectful disagreements to diplomacyandiscourse@gmail.com. I read every single one, and your questions often shape future episodes. Until next time, keep thinking critically, keep paying attention to the quiet processes that shape the loud ones, and remember, in a democracy, the lines we draw define the choices we get. I'm AR, and this has been Democracy and Discourse. Take care.